let's let these last couple folks fill in their fully join. Okay, well, thank you all for coming today. My name is Tom Eichsner. I'm the chair of the board for the Cienega Watershed Partnership. And this is a new series of lunch and learns that we're planning to do the first Wednesday of every month at noon. I'll just note that next month's presenter will be Rana Tucker, and she'll be speaking about the pronghorn of the Sonoyta Plains, past and present. Today's will be with Dennis Caldwell, but I'm going to have Anna Marie Shaker, which I probably have not pronounced right, even though I should know it by now, who are both also on the board. But I'll leave to Anna Marie to introduce Dennis and herself. So go ahead, Anna Marie. Hi,
I'm Anna Marie Shaker. Relatively new board member to the CWP, but former youth outreach coordinator in the past. So it's a pleasure to see you all here. It's very exciting to have you join us. I'm going to introduce Dennis to you. Dennis is a Tucson-based freelance graphic designer and biologist. Dennis has spent thousands of hours in the Cienega watershed getting to know the land and its local landowner and local landowners. He'll be speaking about his conservation work during the presentation, but I also wanted to mention his key role in working with students in the watershed. Dennis is always willing to share his knowledge and expertise with the watershed youth. The CWP board is also fortunate to learn from Dennis. As we said, he's a recent board member. And you can learn more about Dennis through his Wall of Honor nomination in 2015 that's on the cienega.org website. So I encourage you all to visit that.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for taking a little time out of the middle of your day. Hopefully I can make this entertaining and interesting. I'm going to kind of walk you through a little bit of a PowerPoint so I can show you some pictures and some video of the Frog Project and give you some background and help you understand just what all was involved. It was a very successful project that happened in, it was a 3-year project starting in 2010 through 13. And our goal was to do restoration work of the primarily the Chiricahua leopard frog population, which was in decline at Las Cienegas in the entire valley. And we wanted to try and recover that species populations in that valley where it used to be very abundant and probably one of the biggest strongholds in this region. And I'll explain some details on that once I get this rolling. Escape. Let's get into screen share first and desktop 2 and play. Okay, is that up? Are you, oh. All right, are you seeing that now?
Yeah, I see it.
Yes, now.
Okay, so the Frog Project was funded primarily by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We worked primarily on BLM lands, but also private and Forest Service. Pima County was a major part of this, and Match and some of their lands were part of this as well. And then the Cienega Watershed Partnership were our parent organizer, maintaining the grant and managing the whole program. Our team members, the primary members were Netzine, Phil, myself, and David. We were we're all biologists, and we've all got working knowledge of the area and of the species involved. The species that we're working with, Frog Project actually stands for fish and frogs and restoration and partnerships and outreach. So we tried to encompass all of those things, and some of the species that we were primarily concerned about are leopard frogs. Both the Chiricahua leopard frog and lowland leopard frog are part of the valley, the Chiricahua leopard frog being a more endangered species than the lowland leopard frog. But we were working the system as a whole. Sonoran mud turtles, longfin dace, Gila top minnow, and Gila chub are the primary fish species. In our efforts, we've created habitats where we actually have included desert pupfish as well, to be included in those habitats because they're a species that needs places to live, and we created some good habitats. Mexican garter snake and Huachuca water umbel is also in the valley. The northern Mexican garter snake is one of our primary species of concern there. And we recognize that it primarily is suffering due to the fact that the leopard frog population had plummeted, and bullfrogs, which are a non-native species, had moved in and will also be eating garter snakes. But without a food base for the garter snakes, and their food base is the leopard frogs, their population was suffering also. But we realized we didn't really have to do very much for that snake other than repair the base of the food chain so that it could be more happy. Our project work area, just to orient you, that's I-10 at the top of that map. As you head down Route 83, that whole valley you're driving through between the Santa Ritas to the west and the Whetstone Mountains to the east is the Cienega Creek Valley. It flows north from Sonoyta, turns west after it crosses I-10, and then you have Pima County Preserve, or Cienega Creek Preserve, along the north end of I-10, and it dries up shortly around, or somewhere near Vail, and then turns into the Pantano Wash, which flows on into Tucson. But down in the Cienega Creek Valley, near Sonoyta and in the middle of the valley, it's mostly grasslands, as I'm showing in this picture in the background there. It's a beautiful landscape, still very wild, and lots of room to do projects like this. Here's a little bit of a map that shows kind of the focus area, and I can't get my pointer to work on there, but the dark blue lines at the top of the map are the perennial reaches of Cienega Creek, the parts that have water all year round. And there's a little blue spot just to the left of that that is Empire Gulch, right by the Empire Ranch. A lot of people have seen that, but not very many people have actually seen the wetted portions of Cienega Creek, which is a very complex habitat with deep pools. Some of the pools are over 6 feet deep, and it's just a very good habitat for aquatic species. Now, the light blue outline around this is the watershed, everything that's draining into Cienega Creek. And here's a better example of that, showing how well connected that whole area is with the creek. And so we had to worry about initially getting rid of the invasive species. The only species that we really had in the creek were bullfrogs, but we know that bullfrogs move long distances, especially when they're following creeks and channels. So we mapped out, using maps like this, we were able to figure out where the most connected areas were, and we just did surveys of every wet place within the watershed and surrounding watershed, which we call the frog shed. where bullfrogs could be coming in from. And we would isolate those places and remove the bullfrogs until we had everything out. And then we just concentrated our efforts on the creek itself, where we could remove the bullfrogs from the creek. It took us 3 years to do that, and a lot of manual labor, but we were able to achieve that goal. In the process, we identified other non-native species in the watershed, mostly in private ponds, and wherever possible, we would eliminate those species as well. Some of the private landowners are cooperative for those sort of things, others are not. But we feel like we've gone a long way to reduce that risk for the entire valley through our efforts of surveys and eradication efforts. After that, we set up habitats where we could establish some of these species. Typically, we work with cattle tanks. These are livestock waters. This particular one is Cottonwood Pond. It was a water that's used for livestock and is still used for livestock. We were able to put a fence around the pond to isolate it from the livestock. The cows can no longer go into this pond to drink, and that creates lush vegetation around the edges. The water stays nice and clear, and it becomes a really good habitat for aquatic species. Working with the rancher, we could then set these tanks up so that they have water that feeds out to drinkers for the cattle. So the livestock are still able to use these sites. We share the same well, the same solar panels. It's just one pipe goes to the cows and one pipe goes to the fish and frogs and the wildlife. This particular pond, that portion to the top of the picture is outside of the fence. So the cattle are able to use that. And the portion in the center bottom is all inside the fence. These areas became very productive. As an example, here's 2015, and that's already 2 years after we had added water to this. And it was already starting to become pretty good habitat. And then by 2019, I took this picture last fall, it is just blossomed, no pun intended, and turned into a really good habitat with lots of cover, and the species are doing very well there. Here's another picture. Actually, a little video here as I'm approaching the pond. See if it will run. Those are all baby frogs. This is at a different pond. You can just imagine with millions of frogs like that, that there's also, what our plan is that by creating these habitats where, here's another one, where we can create a safe haven for these species, they can reproduce, and during the rainy season, when the weather becomes appropriate, all these babies will disperse across the landscape. And we wanted to have these located strategically in different areas where these frogs could disperse into Cienega Creek, which was our primary goal, was to reestablish them in the creek. And by doing this, we had lots of potential sources for the frogs to then move naturally to the creek. And if anything happens at the creek, if the creek were to dry up, they have these refuge sites that they can fall back onto to get away from the dried areas and to be able to find some wet areas. So here's a big overview satellite image. The blue dot is Empire Gulch. When we started our project, that was the only population of breeding leopard frogs in the valley bottom. That lush area you see going right up through the middle of your screen is Cienega Creek. That's where all of the really good habitat is. And we worked with a rule of dispersal where areas within a mile would be easily dispersed too. So any water within a mile of a breeding leopard frog site could easily have connectivity with our primary breeding location at Empire Gulch. And a lot of these red dots are the cattle tanks that we worked with in order to establish new populations in the valley. And when you overlap each of those, as each of those becomes a population that is pumping out lots of baby frogs, you can see how pretty much the entire valley is now saturated with frogs. Potentially, they can move into any of these areas and reestablish wet places. Things dry out, they can fall back on a different place. It's all really well connected now due to our efforts. And the creek is completely in the middle of all of this with frogs being poured into it. And it's been very successful that way. The frogs showed up in the creek almost immediately and have reestablished in a number of locations and are doing really well there. Through our work, we also discovered through some mark and recapture work that some of these frogs are moving greater distances than what we had anticipated. Here's two examples of frogs that were found to have moved to locations that were quite a bit further. I think this was 11 miles from these two sites. And so I wanted to just see, by extrapolating out on that 11 miles, our whole picture looks more like that, which is even more saturated with frogs. So I guess that was really the crux of how this project worked, and how we were able to pull everything together and with some easy setups of these watering holes for livestock to be able to turn those into habitats. The hard part was getting rid of the invasive species, and I don't want to play that down because the bullfrogs were very difficult to get rid of. I don't think any of us in this project going into it really thought that we could achieve that goal. Our primary aspirations were to try and get the numbers low enough to where maybe we could get some garter snakes and leopard frogs living in that system along with the bullfrogs. Amazingly enough, when we got their numbers down low enough, something strange happened. And I think there's a critical threshold with some of these species that once their numbers are low enough, that natural predators start working with you. And we would go back to places where we would have a problem bullfrog that was still holding out on us that we couldn't get. And he just would have disappeared. And we would never know, is he really gone or did he just move somewhere else? But eventually, doing enough surveys and follow-up surveys after the project, we've determined that they are all completely gone and something else was working with us, taking out the stragglers. And so that was huge. The other thing that I can't say enough about is how easy of an area this is to work in as far as partnerships are concerned. Here's a partial list of some of our partners. And I mean, most of it is public land. Las Ciénegas is a national conservation area, and that encompasses a large portion of that. You get very far to the east or west and you're into national forest. which is also easy to work with for conservation work. We had private ranches, but large private ranches that take up large areas. And that's a lot easier than dealing with small private properties. The Barrel Earl Ranch has a lot of the ranch land surrounding Las Ciénegas, and they also are the ones running the cattle operation within Las Ciénegas. And the owner of that ranch, Ian Tomlinson, is very conservation friendly and was real easy to work with. And we made sure that we did a lot of cooperative agreements so that we would have mutual benefits from all of these setups. We were able to buy solar panels and new pumps for some of the wells, and those are all water that he needs for his operation. So it was a mutual beneficial situation. And it was mutually beneficial for the frogs too, because what we learned was that where there are cows, there are flies, and frogs like flies. So it worked out really good on that level. So I guess I also would like to thank all of these partners, and that's kind of a quick run through of what the project was all about. And I wanted to leave time for questions. I can get unmuted. Do I have any questions from anybody?
Dennis, this is Sheila. How are you going to maintain this project now? Keep the bullfrogs out, keep the frogs going. How's that going to work out?
Well, so after the project is over now, for the last several years, BLM, who is the managers of Las Ciénegas, where the majority of this work still is, has things in place like these habitats that were created from the cattle tanks. They've been able to come up with funding to be able to keep surveys being done so we can make sure that there are not new bullfrogs coming into the creek. They've been able to maintain funding to do what we call the buffer zone. So we have an area where we've identified at the edge of the watershed where bullfrogs are just outside of that watershed and could potentially be moving in. And we've documented them moving in from that direction. So every year during the monsoon season, we send a team of biologists out to that area to check some key locations, some cattle tanks near the town of Elgin and Sonoyta, where we can monitor for bullfrogs and remove them right there before they actually come into the conservation area. So that's been really good. And then there's always been a little bit of money for me to go out there every other month and check on all of these sites and make sure that the pumps are still working and that solar panels are still working and that there's water in the ponds. With the political climate changing, BLM is under a lot of pressure to change their ways and be a lot less conservation friendly and maybe a lot more extraction friendly for miners and ranchers and things like that. So we're just keeping our fingers crossed that examples like this will show, that there is a lot of public interest and a lot of benefit to these conservation areas and these public lands to be able to do conservation on them. I mean, it is a conservation area after all.
Thanks.
Anybody else?
Yes, thank you, Dennis. This is Ian Murray here. Quick question, maybe not so quick. Do you have any recent observations or can you comment on any chytrid die-offs in the cattle ponds versus the stream environments of Los
Yeah.
Angeles?
Yeah, so chytrid is for anybody who doesn't know, is a worldwide amphibian disease that's been causing amphibian declines globally. And Cienega Creek is the first place that we discovered it in the United States. And so it has been here for quite a while. And it also has played a big role. Originally, we thought it was playing the biggest role in the decline of this species, Chiricahua leopard frog and the lowland leopard frog. As it turns out, they are able to survive, and probably a little bit better every year. Things often become immune to, or slightly immune to, a novel disease like this, is that when it comes into a new population, they can potentially be building up resistant year after year, the ones that survive, and can maybe, hopefully, eventually become, be able to live with the disease. Kind of like what we're doing with COVID right now. And what we wanted to do is just maintain their populations big enough, since there's nothing we could do about the disease. We wanted to keep these populations big and healthy, and that gives them more opportunities to evolve and to live with this disease, instead of dwindling down to just a few individuals and then they just disappear. And I think that we've been, hugely successful at that end of things. But in the process, we've watched, and the disease affects frogs worse during cold weather events. So it's during the winter that we have these mass die-offs, where we'll go to a place like Cottonwood Pond, where you saw that video with all of the babies hopping around. And in the spring, there will not be an adult frog in that pond. We cannot find them anywhere. And we find lots of dead frogs, like they've all died except for their tadpoles. The tadpoles are more resistant to this disease and can overwinter. And so that video that I showed was of the emerging young frogs that have come out of the water and now are happy in there without any mom and dad. They're just like kids gone crazy, and they will disperse all over the valley. But what we're seeing down in the creek is completely different, because down in the creek, it's a much colder place. It's shaded by trees. There's the water, gets so cold that it ices over in a lot of areas. And the frogs are dying there also because of those cold conditions. But there's also springs that come out in different areas along the creek. And those springs maintain a constant temperature. Even though it's not warm, it's a constant temperature, and it's warmer than the ambient water. And that the frogs surviving around those springs tend to have a much higher survival rate. And that was what we think the reason why the Empire Gulch spring population had persisted as long as it did, because it had the spring and it had no bullfrogs. So it had that water temperature perfect during the winter, and it had no predators in the way of bullfrogs or non-native species during the summer. So it was, these things are all starting to come to light through trial and error of this project, just like that dispersal information that we stumbled across as we were doing regular surveys with the frogs. We've learned that they can actually travel much further than we had anticipated.
Dennis, do you think the boom and bust annual cycle, essentially, of the leopard frogs impacts the ability of the larger individual garter snakes to be able to get enough to eat?
Absolutely, that could be a major factor, especially in areas without fish. Most of the areas we're talking about do have significant fish populations as well. The native fish populations are doing really well in Cienega Creek. The native fish in all of our habitats are doing really well. So the garter snakes will feed on both the fish and the frogs. And they'll also feed on other things. I've seen them feeding on rodents, for instance, mice. So there are other things. And so I think that there's probably just, you know, garter snakes are not going to be feeding during the winter, but they will start feeding in the spring when there might be a lull in the frog population without there being hardly any adults around. But there's still tadpoles and there's still fish.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Dennis, there's a question in the chat from Mead, and it talks about the big impact of this project, but then if you can speak directly to or reiterate how your team studies have established helpful frog management information for other places, for other watersheds, and maybe some of the findings on chytrid as well. So.
Yeah, and I think I covered the chytrid stuff a little bit. But yeah, we are really hoping to promote this as a is one of the few examples of successful reestablishment of an amphibian species on such a large landscape level. We've known from other projects that trying to work in a small area that has influences from all around it is very difficult, that you really have to look at the entire watershed and start there and fix those problems before you even try to accomplish your goals, because we would not have been successful had we not been able to remove the bullfrogs from the entire watershed. And so, you know, that is probably one of the biggest lessons. We probably get the most inquiries about the bullfrog eradication because that's been so unsuccessful elsewhere that a lot of people are struggling, you know, we're trying to pinpoint just what it is that we did right that we were able to accomplish this. And so we've laid out a lot of those, and I think I laid out a lot of that in here, and it's primarily, again, working with the entire watershed. And when there's private property within that, it becomes very difficult. It just takes one pond owner, one landowner that has a pond on their property that's loaded with bullfrogs. They're going to disperse, just like the dispersal maps that I showed you of the leopard frogs. They cover a huge area, and they reproduce very quickly, having egg masses with 1,000 babies every time they lay eggs. So that's just from one female. So it happens very fast, and you end up with lots of invasive bullfrogs instead of the species you're trying to protect. There was another interesting point about that, and that was that one of our big challenges going into this was the Rosemont mine. We did not know what to expect from that. We didn't know if all of this work would be for nothing. A lot of these sites that we're working with, the Creek and Empire Gulch, are liable to be dewatered in the future. And by establishing a good population of frogs in this area, we might be just setting ourselves up for disaster in the long term. And that has kind of changed my whole mind about these temporary refuge sites. The cow ponds, we went into this thinking those were just a temporary step to being able to support the creek habitat of leopard frogs and garter snakes and fish. Now that we're deeper into this whole project and we've seen how successful those habitats have been, it's become real blatant to me anyway that they're all supported with a well and a solar panel, and they're drought proof. It doesn't matter what is happening out there in June. These frogs and fish are safe and happy. It doesn't matter what happens if somebody starts building too many vineyards down in Sonoyta and Elgin and there's less water coming into Cienega Creek and it's no longer perennial, which could easily happen. other impacts like mines. All of these things impact the water table, and the water table is what sustains the springs and the creek. And it had not been our goal to protect the creek and those springs, the animals that are living in there with these basically artificial habitats that we've created. But in hindsight now, we're realizing that these might play a bigger role in the near future. We don't know how bad droughts are going to get. We don't know what kind of impacts we're going to have to the water table. But we do know that we've got a whole suite of habitats for aquatic species that cannot live without water. Anything else? Come on, somebody throw me a tough one.
Hey, Dennis?
Yeah.
I just wanted to add one thing that I think was left out, which is that these ponds, sorry, this is Alan, that these ponds are really beautiful places to visit too. So I've had my parents come in out of town from Connecticut twice, and both times have gone down and checked out the ponds. One of them just gets completely ringed in flowers during one season. There was funding for interpretive signs that Dennis made that are awesome. And it's just, it's an opportunity. It's for me and for them. It was how they learned that such a thing as the leopard frog exists, and that there's conservation efforts happening in the area. So I just think it's a cool piece of the puzzle that you can actually go down and see these places and spend some time there. And the other thing I was wondering is all the monitoring, acoustic monitoring, is it just a matter of spending time down there listening to frog noises?
No, it's actually primarily visual encounter surveys. The Arizona Game and Fish Department's frog program has protocols in place for what they want done in order to be the most thorough about detection of different species. And so that involves walking the creek during the day, and also involves going down there at night to walk at night. We also encourage, they also encourage using recording devices, actually playback devices. You can a lot of times be able to detect frogs in a really complex habitat like Cienega Creek if you're able to play a recording of the frog. Sometimes if there's some around, the males will start calling in response to that. So it's another tool in a toolbox, but it primarily involves people having to go down there and trudge through the jungle and visually look for them.
Cool.
Trisha Garrett in the chat sort of wondering why was the project so successful here, whereas versus other watersheds? Is it some aspect of the watershed, some aspect of your efforts, some aspect of cooperation of landowners, particularly, right, the bullfrog eradication and that key, right? Why was that successful here and it hasn't been maybe elsewhere? So,
primarily land ownership. We were mostly dealing with accessible land, very little private land.
Yeah.
So all of our federal and state partners and county partners, landowners, manage the majority of the land that we're dealing with.
Yeah. I mean, are there other, I guess, specifically about the Chiricahua leopard frog and maybe the Mexican garter snake, are there other spaces in southern Arizona where the strategy like this might, where could the strategy move from this watershed into others? I mean, that might be successful versus ones that might be more challenging. So.
Well, okay, so there's been a huge amount of resources poured into the area around Ruby Road, in the Atascosa Mountains, the Pinalena, or
the Arivaca area,
Arivaca, and that's been fairly successful also. That most of these watersheds have something in them that is just completely makes it impossible to ever get ahead of the invasive species. For instance, in that area off of Ruby Road is Pina Blanca Lake. And that has always been full of non-native fish and bullfrogs. And without being able to dry it up to get rid of the bullfrogs, it was one of those impossible sites that we could never really get ahead of. And there was a lot of good populations of Chiricahua leopard frogs struggling to survive in that area, as well as Tarahumara frogs, which actually were extirpated from the United States, that we wanted to recover in that area that we just could never really work with. And there was an issue with the lake being having heavy metals in it, and so fishermen couldn't even eat the fish out of there. And some money became available to drain the lake and dredge it in order to make that a fishing pond again, where people could actually go and fish and recreate without having those heavy metals in the water that had leached out of surrounding mines. So once that became available, the Game and Fish Department was able to go in there while it was drained and remove the bullfrogs. And at that point, this big effort was able to just extrapolate from that problem spot throughout the watershed and take care of any other rogue populations of bullfrogs throughout that entire region. Yeah. Same situation, the leopard frogs came right back and were thriving for quite a while. So, you know, that's another example. On the other end of that watershed is Aravaipa Lake. So you still have a problem that you cannot deal with, that's just pouring bullfrogs into the system. Yeah. And so there's very few other watersheds that we have like this. I mean, Cienega Creek that's one of the reasons it's such a crown jewel. It's one of the last places in this part of the world that still has its entire suite of native species living in the water. Nobody has dumped sport fish in there. Nobody has dumped crayfish in there. Nobody has dumped turtles in there. You know, all of these things that you find in places like the San Pedro River, which make it completely useless as far as native aquatic species. San Pedro still looks great, and it's great for migratory birds and other types of wildlife, but for aquatic species, it's just, it's not even a place we can work with.
Right, and like the challenge on the San Pedro is it's a connected river, it's binational, and it's such a large space to try to extirpate, try to get rid of bullfrogs there would be a real heavy lift, and probably next to impossible. So, and crayfish the same way. Crayfish are even harder to remove than bullfrogs. So,
Any other questions?
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Dennis. It was really great.
Thank you, everybody, for turning out. This is our first one of these that we've done. We're hoping we're going to keep doing more of these, and please spread the word.
Yeah. Like I said, Raina Tucker from Fish and Wildlife will be speaking August 5th at noon, and she'll be talking about the pronghorn and the Sonoyta Plain. So thank you all for coming out.
Well done. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Glenn.